Clear that smudge off the lens. Should help a little bit with clarity. Hey, it's Mike. Let's talk about Reaper. In today's episode, I'd like to go back to a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and that's drum editing. While I'm aware that there's a lot of people now that love to use drum sampling software, I still firmly believe that I'm not alone in my passion for tracking and editing live drums. If you've ever downloaded multi-tracks for mixing from certain high-profile online education sites, you may have noticed that in many cases the multi-tracks that you receive appear to have already been edited and processed. No matter how good you are at mic placement, it's literally impossible to eliminate 100% of bleed on a multi-mic instrument such as drums. I would even argue that it's the bleed across the multiple mics that helps to add a bit of realism to the drum sound. With all that said, there is still some benefit to trimming some of your tracks. For example, in the project that we're about to look at, the toms are not used very much in the drum performance. But because of the proximity to the kick drum, each time that the kick drum is hit, it triggers, pun intended, a bit of unwanted resonance from the toms. Let's take a look at that project and see what options we have to help prepare our drum tracks for mixing. The project I've got open is just something that I threw together to have some audio to work with. Changes with my work schedule has led to me not tracking nearly as much as I'd like to, and I definitely don't want to use copyrighted multi-tracks because you know what that does to the algorithm. I'll solo the drums and let's take a listen to this chorus. And that's a pretty decent performance. Now this is a one take and it has not been edited yet, so I'm definitely not expecting perfection here, but one thing that I notice, as we said in the intro, is that if I take a look at these toms, the toms are only hit a few times across the entire performance. I've currently got ReaGate on the tom tracks, but let's remove those, and I'll play back that chorus with the toms soloed and take a listen. Now that doesn't sound bad. The tom hits are obviously much louder than the bleed from other instruments, but ideally I would love to be able to cut that resonance out. Of course, as we saw previously, I can do that with ReaGate. I'll add ReaGate to my tom's bus and take a listen. There is a preset in ReaGate for toms. I'll just add that. And I find that in most cases the default setting is fine, but let's take a listen and see how it works. And that actually cleans up pretty well just by putting that on the bus. But if we wanted to achieve those pristine tracks just like we would receive from the online mixing courses, we can take this a step further. I'll remove the gate, and I'd like to turn off my grouping for a moment so we can work with these tracks individually. I just find that I get better results if I do these one at a time as opposed to in groups. So with my groups disabled, I'll highlight my first tom track and go to Actions, Show Action List, and search for Silence. The action that I'm looking for is Item, Auto Trim, Split Items, Remove Silence. I'll double click that to run the action. And this brings up my Auto Trim and Split Items dialog. This can take a little bit of trial and error to get your settings just right, but I've used a threshold of -24 dB with a hysteresis of 0. I'd like to ignore silence shorter than 10 milliseconds, and I'd like for my non-silent clips to be no shorter than 300 milliseconds. I want to make sure that I do still have a little bit of a trail from the initial transient on the toms. I've added a leading and a trailing pad of 25 milliseconds, and this auto-adjust snap offset to peak value in the first 50 milliseconds I've left to the default. For mode, I have split and remove silent areas, and I've left the lower 3 check marks at their default with only the center one checkmarked, preserve timing of non-silent areas, and process. Now you can see what this has done is removed all of the areas where I wasn't actually playing the toms. I'll zoom in a bit and we can see that that tom hit looks to be pretty good. As I scroll down the timeline, the secondary tom hit looks like that's pretty good as well. Let's go back and repeat the process on Tom 2. I'll highlight the track, go to my actions list, and since that was an action that I recently ran, it still shows here in my recent actions list, and I can click the same action again, auto trim and split items, remove silence. The same settings that I had last time are still here, and that should be fine for this track as well. If my settings are successful, we should have all of this quieter area removed and only the 3 transients of the tom hits remaining. That looks good as well. My Tom 3 track, it looks like I didn't hit that tom at all, so quite frankly, I am safe to either remove this track completely, or I may use that bleed just to help enhance the tone. Let's leave it for now, and unsolo our tom's bus, and go back and take a listen to the drum tracks. Now to my ear, that gives us a much cleaner drum sound, but since we have our room mics and our overheads, we still have the level of realism that I'm looking for. Again, some bleed is great, but I find that in a lot of cases the resonance from the bottom head of my toms tends to add a lot of mud to the drums. Let's solo our Tom 3 track and take a listen to that. If you'll recall, our Tom 3 track was not really used. I had the mic engaged, but apparently never hit the 3rd tom. Now, if you listen closely on that, I would imagine you can still hear the resonance of that tom as I hit the kick drum. I think what I'd like to do, instead of completely muting this or taking it out of the project, is just to turn it down. I'd like to keep some of that noise in there to just help make the toms and the kit more consistent, but I don't want that resonance causing a problem. Now we're at the awkward point of having just these few hits here. I know that some people like having the individual hits and nothing else, but I tend to prefer having a project length track for each part of my drum kit. If I take a look at my other tracks that I've trimmed to the start, we can see that this actually started at the very beginning of the project. So what I'd like to do is create a time selection from the beginning of the project to where the drums end. And now if I highlight Tom 1 and right-click and drag to select both of these hits, I can then right-click and glue items within time selection. And that creates a project length track for my toms. I'll do the same with Tom 2. I'll right-click and drag to select these 3 hits. Then right-click again, and glue items within time selection. So now I've got project length tracks for each of my toms, but I've trimmed out the silence to where I've only got the parts that I want to be audible. I haven't done a live drum edit for a while, so let's take this a step further and go ahead and get these drums cleaned up. First thing I'd like to do is hide my dock so I can see all of my tracks, and I will make sure that all of my tracks are the same length to start. I'll turn my grouping back on, and I notice that my tom tracks are no longer grouped with the rest of the tracks. So I'll terminate my grouping for a moment, which is probably a good idea anyway, and I need to make sure a couple of things are lined up. So let's take a look at our snare and make sure that our snare hits are lined up, and they appear to be. Now we can confirm this a bit further since my snares are in a folder track by taking a look at the aggregate waveform here, and I can see that the snares are lined up just fine. I'll move my playhead here just so I can keep up with where that first transient is. And it does look like my snare bottom could stand to move just a little bit. So I will highlight my snare bottom and I'll hold Alt on the keyboard, and you can see that my cursor has changed to have a left-right arrow. That allows me to slip at it so I can move the waveform within the confines of the media item. I'll move that just a bit to get that a little bit better lined up. And as I look at my aggregate waveform in the snares folder track, you can see that I'm getting that much more in line. That looks good there. Now I'll go down and take a look at my overheads. Now my overheads do appear to be in line with each other, but the transient's not necessarily matching up. So I will grab my overhead tracks and slide those just a bit. And those transients are now lined up with my snare transient. Now it's important to understand that at this phase I do not have my tracks grouped. I wanted to make these moves individually to make sure that they're lined up before I start editing. And finally, I'd like to take a look at my room mics Now my room mics, I do not like to line up with the Snare Transient because with these mics being clear across the room, it is pretty much impossible for that sound wave to hit the room mics at the same time that it hits the close mics. I'll expand my view just a little bit better. And all that I want to do here is just make sure that my room mic transients are lined up with each other. I'm totally fine with them being a little bit later than the close mics because that makes sense. Everything appears to be lined up and we're ready to start editing, so what I'd like to do now is draw a box around all of my drum tracks and group them. I'll also want to right-click my grouping icon and make sure that selecting one item selects the group, because any movements that I make at this point needs to be performed across the entire selection of drum tracks and not just one. I'll zoom my project out a bit. And I want to start with my kick and my snare top. So with those two highlighted, I'll zoom in to where I can see those better. And of course, my most important thing is making sure that my first transient is on grid. Now, admittedly, there is a faster way to do this. You'll notice in my toolbar that I have this fast edit and normal edit buttons, and those are some mouse modifier actions that change some of the default behaviors in Reaper to make this a lot quicker. I'll do this with all stock actions, but if you'd like to learn more about the fast edit and the normal edit buttons, I do have a drum editing and Reaper course available on Pro Mix Academy. Check the link in the description. So with my drum tracks all selected, I want to make sure that my first kick transient is on grid. I'll hold Alt to go into my slip editing mode again, and I'll slide that first one into place. Now my kick is on grid, and I'll start to go down the line and take a look at my snare and kick transients just to make sure that they're lined up. It's also important to make sure that in this stage I've got my snapping disabled, and there's an option to add a crossfade automatically on split. I've got that in my toolbar, but there's an action if you go to your actions list and search for crossfade on split. There's options, toggle auto crossfade on split. Since that starts with options, I imagine it's also in the options list. And if it is in here somewhere, I am just not seeing it, so I'll go back to my actions list and run options, toggle auto crossfade on split. Now we can see that my icon is highlighted to suggest that that option is turned on. And my first snare transient is off a bit, so I'll go back and add a split before that transient. The default key press in Reaper for a split is the letter S. You may have that bound to something else, but I've still got mine set to S. So there's my split and crossfade, and you can see that that's performed across all the tracks. Now I'll hold Alt and left click and drag to move that transient into place, and move on down the line. I'll zoom out a bit so we can see more. Those two kick transients seem fine, but my snares are off a bit, so I'll add a split before that transient and slip edit this into place. That's fine, my kick is fine. Now we're off grid a little bit here, and I realize I'm rushing through this, but I want to try to get through this as quickly as possible just to kind of show you that this is very much doable. Moving down the line. Those look good. That snare's off just a little bit, and these kicks are off a little bit as well. So I believe what I'd like to do is split before the snare and slide that into place. And that has brought my kicks in line as well. We'll move on down. Make a minor edit here. And now I'll need to pull that snare back into place. Kicks look good there. The snare is off just a touch. I say this a lot in my drum editing course, but I don't like to go through and make every little hit 100% on the grid. I do like to preserve the human element, but I just want to make edits where the feel is necessary, if that makes sense. Now this looks like this may be the build, yeah, going right into the chorus, so I'd like to make sure that these are on grid as best as possible. And you'll notice that I'm moving back and forth between the snare and the kick track, and if I'm honest, that's just a bad habit that I've built up. I can actually create my split or do the slip edit from any of these tracks since they're grouped. For example, I need to move this snare top back a bit, so I can click here on my kick track and add the split, and that's added the split on the snare track as well. Now I've added that crossfade and split a little bit too soon, so I can hold shift over the crossfade and move that back a little bit, and hold alt to go back into slip editing mode even if I'm on my kick track, and of course that's going to move the snare track with it, along with all the other grouped tracks. And our first transient on the chorus is off now, so we'll split and move that kick into place. And just go down the line paying attention to our kick and snare. Now you may wonder why I'm not doing much with the toms. If you'll remember, there's not a lot of tom hits in this. But even if there are a lot of tom hits, I typically tend to go through and get my kick and my snare in place first, and then if necessary, I'll go back and edit the remainders. I want to make sure that the primary beats are in place and that the backbone of the song is established. Then we can make smaller edits inside of those guidelines if we need to. A decent drummer will typically be in time with him or herself, but they may just be off the grid a bit. And what I mean by that is if I get these kicks and snares in place, the tom work is usually pretty well in line as well. Again, that varies drastically depending on the skill level of the drummer in question. In this case, it's me, and I'm not a fantastic drummer, but I do well enough. And we're almost done. Got a snare hit here that's a bit early, so we'll move that. These editing type of videos are always fun to do because there's not really a lot to say during this. Once you understand the basics, you tend to just kind of zone out and go through it almost on autopilot. Although I am having to think about this a bit more since I'm not using my fast edit mode. Alright, that looks like we've got it all completed. So let's go ahead and bring our dock back up, unsolo the drums, and take a listen to our work. And that's it. I hope this helps. If you like the content you're seeing, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and you can support the channel further by clicking the Buy Me a Coffee or Super Thanks link below. Membership for the channel is also available, and I'd love to hear your ideas for member-exclusive content. Visit us on Discord and engage with other active Reaper users, and don't forget to check out my drum editing and Reaper course on Pro Mix Academy. We'll see you next time.